Hello, hello. It is the end of the month, which of course means it's time for a monthly wrap up and TBR video. So let's get into it. All right, so in September, I read 7 books. I finished 7. I'm in the middle of 2 right now that I'm just pushing off into my October TBR. Before I dive too far in, I am going to really quickly go over my reread of The Raven Cycle. I did actually end up finishing it this month. I thought I was only going to be able to read the second and third book in that series, but I did actually end up finishing it. So I'll go over that really quick since that took up 3 of my books this month. But I've already read it, so I don't want to do like a full in-depth review. I did read this in, I want to say 2018, so it's been quite a few years since I read it, and I was a little bit worried that it wouldn't hold up as much as it did in my mind when I read it, and I was very pleasantly surprised that I think it held up really well, and pretty much everything that I remembered about it was still true. I think the core of this whole series is really the dynamics between the group and the ways that their relationships evolve and develop throughout the book series are really beautiful. I really love the exploration of their friendships and how their friendships kind of extend beyond being what we typically consider platonic in a lot of cases. So I really loved reading through all of those relationships again, and I didn't remember that it left off on such like an open-ended thing. I thought that it was a little bit more closed up than it was, which I am glad about because I have the entire next series on my spinning bookcase over here that I never managed to get to because it came out a few years after I'd already read them, I believe. And by the point that I would have been ready to dive into them when they had all come out, because I have a thing with series where I really prefer to read them after all of the books are out, or else I just forget about them. But by the time all of the books had come out, for sure, I didn't really remember a lot of what happened in the original 4 books. So I'm glad that I did this reread so that I can actually remember what happened, so I can go read the new trilogy. I will say I did like misremember quite a few things. I just like made stuff up that happened in the books for some reason. There was like 2 very specific things that I was very sure happened in the books and they didn't. I just made them up. So that was kind of funny to go back and read it and be like, this actually didn't happen at all. So that was quite funny. I will say that I think my ranking order of which book is my favorite has changed. When I initially read this series, The Dream Thieves was my favorite book, and I think that's just because it's so focused on Ronan, and he's for sure my favorite character. I just like love the complexity that you get to see from him in that book specifically, and so that was my favorite when I initially read the 4 books. But I think reading them back, that one's actually my least favorite. Is quite long and drawn out. I think it could have been cut down quite a bit. And it is just like quite dragged out. So that was kind of interesting to see my just opinions on the individual books in the series change. Because I also remember when I initially read the series that the 3rd one was my least favorite, but I actually think that one might be my favorite. I think it's the most action-packed, and there's a lot of emotional relationship development going on just in that one book. And I think it's also the shortest one. So very interesting to see how my rankings changed throughout rereading it, but I'm going to leave all my ratings the same. When I initially rated them, I gave the first one 4 stars and then the rest of them 5 stars, which is a little wonky with how I remember actually feeling about them, but that's what I ended up giving them, and I'm not going to really change that too much since this isn't my first time reading, but my thoughts have changed a little bit, and overall, I really enjoyed this reread, and I think it held up really well, and I'm really glad that I reread them, and I'm excited to get into the trilogy that follows these 4 books. All right, on to all of the rest of the books that I read in September. There's 4 other books that I read besides those. The first book that I ended up finishing that was not part of the Raven Cycle was The Jasad Crown, which is the second book in the Scorched Throne duology. The first one is The Jasad Heir. And this was so good. I was really, really excited for this sequel, and I had really high expectations for it. I really loved the Jasad heir when I read it. I thought it was like a pretty perfectly done intro into a romantasy duology. I ended up giving it 4.5 stars. I had a tiny critique of how quickly we went into a relationship from being enemies or adversaries. But that was my only like minor critique of that book. I think everything else is done perfectly. And the second book adds so much more complexity, and it adds so much to the magic system in the world. And it really explores the nuances of all of the characters in the books. The first book has only 2 perspectives in it, the main 2 characters, but the second book has 4 perspectives in it, I believe. There might be like a couple of chapters that are in an additional perspective, but there's 4 main perspectives. And I really loved the 2 additional perspectives that we got. I loved seeing more from these characters, and I just loved the way that the relationships continue to develop in this book, and the way that we learned more about the world and the magic system in this book, even though it was the second book in a duology. And the story was so beautifully written. It is such a compact and like tightly woven and neatly done story, in my opinion. The plot is like perfectly executed throughout both books. Everything that happens for a reason, and it was just so perfect. This is like my for sure romantasy holy grail at the moment. I ended up giving the Jasad Crown 5 stars, and I won't get into like any spoilers or anything, but I did cry at the end. It was very, very good. I'm really excited to see what else this author writes. And yeah, like I said, this is my romantasy holy grail. I think it is like the perfect combination of romance and fantasy. It didn't feel like we were taking away from any of the fantasy by having this be so dependent on a romance, but it also didn't feel like the romance didn't have time to shine because we were trying to world build. It was just so perfectly balanced, and I loved it so much. This might be my favorite book of the year so far, but we'll see when we get to the end of the year and I do my official like book bracket and ranking and everything. But very, very, very highly recommend the Jasad Heir and the Jasad Crown. The next book that I ended up reading this month was The Salt Grows Heavy by Cassandra Khaw, and this is kind of a like fairy tale horror reimagining, but it is kind of more like in the sci-fi realm, I would say, than the fantasy realm. There are still some fantasy elements, but the majority of the horror is more in the like sci-fi medical Frankenstein kind of realm. This also is pretty heavily dependent on kind of a budding romance. The kind of plot of this is, it is pretty short, so I won't go too much into the plot, but this follows a mermaid who recently, the kingdom that she married into, everyone's dead, so she's off to find a new kingdom to live in. And she finds this plague doctor, and they were like, hey, I would really love to travel with you. You seem pretty incredible. They had some communication before the events before the book take place. So they start traveling together to a new kingdom when they stumble upon a village of all of these children who worship these saints who actually do like really weird medical experiments. And the story just kicks off from there. It just follows them while they're in this village pretty much, and they're trying to kind of figure out what's going on and escape. So I think this one I've read 2 of Cassandra Khaw's books. Their first book that I read was Nothing But Blackened Teeth, which is the first book that they published, I believe. And then this is the second book that they've published. And then they just published a new book this summer, The Library at Hellbore. And I definitely liked this book more than Nothing But Blackened Teeth. I thought the characters were a lot more developed, and I thought the plot was a lot tighter, and I thought the horror elements were better done. And my biggest critique of Nothing But Blackened Teeth was that we weren't allowed to really like sit in the horror for long enough, and the suspense wasn't allowed to build. We were kind of just like hopping from one thing to the next, so we weren't really able to build suspense or sit in the horror at all. And I think this one actually had the opposite problem. I did like the horror, but the horror scenes are very drawn out. And you sit in them for a really long time before you move on to the next thing. So it's kind of interesting that I had like opposite critiques of both of them. I also think for how short of a book this is, the first 60% is like quite slow moving, which was strange. I felt like nothing happened for the first 60-70%, and then everything was jammed into the end of the book. So it was quite weirdly paced, in my opinion. Like I said, I didn't end up liking this more than Nothing But Blackened Teeth, and I really think that the characters are the reason why I liked this quite a lot more. We get a lot more development from our characters, and we get to know them a lot better. The characters in Nothing But Blackened Teeth are kind of like caricatures of people, and I didn't think that aspect was used to its full potential. But I think this one, we did get to know the characters a bit more, and we got to see their motivations and everything, even though this is quite a short book still. So I ended up giving this one 3 stars. I haven't decided yet if I'm going to like give The Library at Hellbore a chance. I am not sure that I just love the particular writing style that Cassandra Khaw has, but we'll see. I'll ruminate on it a little bit more. The Library at Hellbore does seem to have an interesting premise. It's something that I would be interested in if I hadn't had 2 kind of like middle of the road lukewarm books that I'd read by this author. So we shall see. All right, then the next book I finished in September was The Possession of Alba Diaz by Isabel Canas, and this is the latest installment. I've read both of Isabel Canas's other works before this one. I read them both last year, and I just absolutely adore her writing style. She is always blending romance and horror in a perfect way, in my opinion. She balances the two really, really nicely, which I really enjoy. And so this was one of my most anticipated reads of the year because it came out in July, I believe. I don't know if that's right. It came out this year recently. And this follows Alba Diaz, as the title would suggest. The story kind of opens with this legend of Alba Diaz, as the narrator is kind of telling you, like, there's this legend and she murdered her groom on her wedding day and she was possessed, and everyone remembers this tale of Alba Diaz, like, on her wedding day running out of the chapel, like, screaming, covered in blood. So that's where we kick off, and then we quickly jump over to our male main character's perspective, where he is actually not in Mexico. He is in the Middle East and then travels to Europe shortly after. But his father had left his family when he was quite young and traveled to Mexico and bought a silver mine, which they're still in debt to a family in Mexico for buying the silver mine. So his grandfather is like, hey, your dad is dead. You have to go take care of this silver mine so that we can have it be successful and be out of debt with these people. So he travels to Mexico to kind of take over operation of this silver mine, but his uncle and his cousin already live in Mexico and are already kind of running it. So he's kind of just joining them to help until they're out of debt. And then he is planning to leave and have nothing else to do with his family. He doesn't really like them. So that's kind of his plan. And then we also meet Alba, and she is engaged to said fiance. She really is afraid of marrying someone that she doesn't want to, and her and the male main character's cousin have been friends since childhood. They both kind of don't want to be married, and so they're kind of entering a marriage in order to have some choice over the matter. And so she's engaged to him, but a sickness breaks out where they live, so she travels with her fiance, who is a cousin, to the silver mines, which are not in town. And strange things start happening. She starts sleepwalking. She's hearing voices, and she reaches out to our male main character for help, and the story unfolds from there. And I really, really enjoyed this. It is kind of a somewhat classic possession story. It does have some unique aspects into how the demon originates, but it is just a demon. There's also some intriguing ways that the demon is conquered at the end, which I quite liked. And again, Isabel Canas is the queen of blending horror and romance, and this book is no different. The romance in this is beautiful. She's the queen of yearning. This book has a lot of yearning in it, and it was just really, really good. I think my one critique was each of her other two books has kind of honed in on a specific theme regarding colonization in Mexico specifically, and I felt that this one didn't really have that going on, and I was missing that kind of central theme a little bit. There wasn't as much of a central theme in this one, and this one was kind of just more about the characters and the way that the characters are acting than it had any central kind of theme, which I felt was lacking a little bit, but I still did really enjoy it. That is like a very minor critique. I ended up giving it 4.5 stars. I think in my ranking of her 3 books, this one's second. Vampires of El Norte is my favorite. I adored that book with my whole heart. And then this one, and then The Hacienda, which was her first book, is my technically least favorite so far that she's released, but I still gave that one 4 stars. So I didn't not enjoy it by any means. It's just been the one that I've liked the least of the 3 that she's released. So if you're looking to get into horror and like romance books, I would highly suggest checking out Isabel Canas. All of her books are fantastic, and I will forever read her books. And then the last book that I ended up reading in September was We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson, and this was quite a bit different than I was expecting it to be. I think that this is pretty light on the horror. A lot of the horror is in the kind of ending of the book. There's a lot of exploration of the characters and the family dynamics in this book. And one of our characters has kind of a fantastical view of the world. And so the characters are quite interesting. I think they're definitely the strongest point of this story. I really enjoyed the ways that they developed, even though the character development isn't necessarily what you might consider to be in the positive direction. I still enjoyed the character development and the way that the characters changed throughout this story quite a bit. It was very interesting to see their perspective and kind of the ways that their perspective added to the horror of this story. But other than them, I don't think this book had a lot of horror in it. There's no like external horror forces, really. There's some like prejudices that the town has against them, which culminate in kind of a climax, but they aren't really like horrifying in the sense. But yeah, it was quite interesting to read. It just like was not what I was expecting at all, especially because I read The Haunting of Hill House, and even though The Haunting of Hill House is not super in depth on the horror elements either, so I wasn't expecting this to be like super in your face with the horror elements. The Haunting of Hill House is very like the atmosphere is really haunting, and there are things that are happening that are definitely in the horror category, and this one was less like that. The atmosphere wasn't super horrifying, and there wasn't a ton of horror elements in this book. This is kind of more of like a general fiction mystery thriller kind of a thing than a horror book, in my opinion. And again, is very rooted in the characters. You have to appreciate what Shirley Jackson is doing with the characters at the very least, if you don't like them, in order to get anything out of this book. So I've seen looked at the reviews after I finished this because I was having quite complex feelings, and I think I did enjoy it a lot more than some people do. Some people just like hated all of the characters and didn't understand what Shirley Jackson was trying to do with them, which you have to at least, like I said, understand what she's trying to do with the characters, even if you don't like them, in order to get anything out of this book. But I didn't like it as much as Haunting of Hill House. I think it had quite a bit more flaws in it. It is very kind of meandering, and the plot takes on a weird, like, winding structure, and I didn't really love that aspect of it. I did quite enjoy the ending, and I liked how we got to the ending for the most part, but the kind of structure of the book was pretty strange to me. I ended up giving it 3.5 stars, so it wasn't like I hated the book or anything. It just was a lot different than what I was expecting again. So that kind of played into my rating of the book, was that I was expecting it to be more horror based, and it's not as much. It's more of just a character study and a study of society, really. So yeah, that is We Have Always Lived in the Castle. And then before I get fully into my TBR, since that is all of the books I actually finished in September, the 2 books that I'm currently in the middle of that are going to technically be on my October TBR, one of them is carried over from my September TBR, which is Celestial Monsters by Aiden Thomas. This is the second book in the Sunbearer Trials duology. I have already started it. Like I said, I'm only like 30-ish pages in, but I'm enjoying it so far. I'm liking getting back into this world. I really enjoy this world. So I'm definitely going to be finishing that out towards the beginning of October, probably. And then the other book that I'm currently in the middle of is Hungerstone by Kat Dunn, which is a Carmilla retelling. I really love the original Carmilla, and I'm really enjoying this so far. I'm about 30% in, and I'm just loving the like greater exploration of women's desires and the way that women's desires have kind of been like pushed off to the side in history. So I'm enjoying it so far, and that one I also will be moving into October before the rest of the TBR. That will probably be the first audiobook that I finish. With that being said, let's get into my full actual October TBR. I guess technically there is also one other book that is moving from my September TBR to my October TBR, and that is Our Share of Night. I did start this last year in July or June, I want to say, and there's no chapters in it, so I was having quite a hard time with it when I was reading it, because especially in the summer, I'm really in the mood for things that are like faster paced and quick to get through and really like hold my attention span with no effort, whereas things that are kind of more dense, I have to try a little bit harder for them to keep my attention. So I didn't get around to starting this back up, but after I finish Celestial Monsters, I'm planning to start this back up. So this will be the other book that's moving from my September TBR to my October TBR, because I'd really like to finish this out this year, since I have already started it, and I do remember pretty well what happened in the first part of this book that I've already read. So yeah, that's the other book that's moving from my September TBR to my October TBR. Then, for all of the new books that are going to be in my October TBR, I have 5 more, because I always put 8 books on my TBRs. The first book is going to be The Bewitching by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. I've read 2 others of hers. I've read 2 other of her horror books, which she writes in a really wide variety of genres. But I have that one as a physical book, so that's going to be one of my physical books. If I can get it down without this whole thing falling over. Okay. So this is going to be one of my other physical books on my TBR. I have quite a few physical books on my TBR, which we'll see if I can get through them all, because that's usually my slowest format. But let me read the synopsis of this one for you. Back then, when I was a young woman, there were still witches. That was how Nana Alba always began the stories she told her great-granddaughter Minerva, stories that have stayed with Minerva all her life. Perhaps that's why Minerva has become a graduate student focused on the history of horror literature and its researching the life of Beatrice Tremblay, an obscure author of macabre tales. In the course of assembling her thesis, Minerva uncovers information that reveals that Tremblay's most famous novel, The Vanishing, was inspired by a true story. Decades earlier, during the Great Depression, Tremblay attended the same university where Minerva is now studying and became obsessed with her beautiful and otherworldly roommate, who then disappeared under mysterious circumstances. As Minerva descends ever deeper into Tremblay's manuscript, she begins to sense that the malign force that stalked Tremblay and the missing girl might still walk the halls of the campus. These disturbing events also echo the stories Nana Alba told about her childhood in 1900s Mexico, where she had a terrifying encounter with a witch. Minerva suspects that the same shadow that darkened the lives of her great-grandmother and Beatrice Tremblay is now threatening her own in 1990s Massachusetts. An academic career can be a punishing pursuit, but it might turn outright deadly when witchcraft is involved. So, obviously very witchy, very academia heavy, which I love in the fall. So I'm very excited to read this one. Since I've enjoyed both of the other books that I've read Mexican Gothic, which actually was one of the books that got me into horror books in the first place, even though I had been watching horror movies for years before that. And then I've also read Silver Nitrate, which was also set in the 90s, which I quite enjoyed. It was set in 90s Mexico, centered on the horror film industry. So really excited for this. This was also one of my most anticipated reads of the year, so I'm excited to be reading that in October. And then the last book on my physical TBR for October is Slewfoot. This is one of my 25 and 2025. And this has been on my TBR for a really, really long time, so I'm really excited to get to this. We're having very witchy vibes in October because this is also very witch heavy. So let me read this very short synopsis for this one for you. Set in colonial New England, Slewfoot is a tale of magic and mystery, of triumph and terror from acclaimed author and artist Brom. An ancient spirit awakens in a dark wood. The wild folk call him father, slayer, protector. The colonists call him Slewfoot, demon, devil. To Abatha, a recently widowed outcast, alone and vulnerable in her pious village, he is the only one she can turn to for help. Together, they ignite a battle between pagan and Puritan, one that threatens to destroy the entire village, leaving nothing but ashes and bloodshed in its wake. So, very excited for this one. Like I said, this has been on my TBR for a very, very long time, and I finally picked up a physical copy of it this year, hence why it's on my 25 and 2025. So, getting through that one, even though I know I'm not going to finish out my 25 and 2025, I will at least be slightly closer with this one. Okay, and then since I already talked about one of the audiobooks that I'm planning to read in October, I'll quickly go over the other one, and that is Where They Burn Books, They Also Burn People. This is technically two different novellas that were originally published separately, put together into one book, and alternating chapters. I believe it is quite short, and the two different novellas take place in different time periods, and as the title would suggest, just is generally about censorship and how that impacts people who are being oppressed. So excited to get to that one. That is part of the books that I'm reading for Latina Heritage Month. So I'll try and get to that one before October 15th. And then for my two digital books for the month, the first is Kiss Me Maybe by Gabriella Gamez, which is the second book in the Romance Disconnected series. It's one of those romance series where each of the books follows a different set of characters. I read The Next Best Fling in July and really, really loved it. And this is the second book in that and follows, I believe it's the main character in The Next Best Fling, her best friend. In that first book, she kind of tells the main character that she thinks that she may be asexual, or at least somewhere on the spectrum of asexuality. And so this second book follows her as she goes on that journey and meets a possible romantic interest. And I'm really excited to get to this because I really, really loved that first book that I read. And this one is sapphic, so I'll probably enjoy it even more. And I'm really excited to get to it. And then the last book on my October TBR is Mooncakes. This is a graphic novel, and it is also on my 25 and 2025, so I can get a little closer to completing that, even though I know I'm not going to finish it all the way out because I just have too many books left from when I wasn't reading in April and May. But this is a graphic novel. It is like witchy and paranormal and sapphic, and looks very cute and sweet. And also, since it is like witchy and paranormal, it's a good graphic novel for the Halloween season. So that is the last book that is on my TBR for October. We shall see if I can get through it all. I do have quite a lot of physical books on here, which physical is my least read format. So we shall see how I do, but I'll, of course, check in with you at the end of the month so I can tell you about all of my reads. If you've watched all the way here, thanks for watching. It was great to catch up with you on all of my reads from September, and I will see you again very soon in the next one.